What would you do if the person you trusted most betrayed you in the cruelest way? Victoria Hayes thought she was living a fairy tale, married to tech billionaire Brandon Mitchell, pregnant with their first child, but at a glittering poolside party. Everything shattered when her husband shoved her toward the water while 8 months pregnant. Her savior, her Navy SEAL brother Jake, who hadn't spoken to her in years. But here's the twist. The brother who saved her had been working for her husband all along. This story has more betrayals than you can imagine. Hit like if you're ready for this wild ride. Comment your predictions. And subscribe because you won't want to miss how this ends. Trust me, you've never heard anything like this. Victoria Hayes stood in the marble bathroom of the Malibu mansion, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. Two pink lines. 8 months of marriage to tech billionaire Brandon Mitchell. And finally, the family she had dreamed of since childhood. The sound of laughter echoed from the living room below. Brandon's voice mixed with another woman's giggles. Victoria's stomach twisted, but she pushed down the familiar knot of anxiety. Tonight was different. Tonight, she had news that would change everything. She had met Brandon 2 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Los Angeles. Victoria was grading art projects from her third-grade class when this magnetic stranger in an expensive suit struck up a conversation. Within minutes, he had convinced her she was wasting her talent teaching children finger painting when she could be creating real art. Brandon Mitchell was everything Victoria's small-town Ohio upbringing had taught her to dream about. Wealthy, charming, and completely devoted to her. Or so it seemed. Their whirlwind romance included private jets to Paris, red carpet premieres, and a proposal on a yacht in the Mediterranean. Victoria had felt like Cinderella, but fairy tales, as Victoria was learning, rarely had happy endings in real life. She walked downstairs, the pregnancy test hidden in her cardigan pocket. Brandon was lounging on the white leather sofa with Scarlett Monroe, the Instagram influencer who seemed to appear at every social gathering. Scarlett's red hair cascaded over her shoulders as she leaned close to Brandon, showing him something on her phone. "Brandon," Victoria said softly, "can I talk to you?" He looked up with that practiced smile that had once made her heart race. Now it felt cold, calculated. "Not now, Tori. Scarlett and I are planning the marketing strategy for the Mitchell Tech launch." Victoria glanced at Scarlett's phone screen. It displayed shopping websites, not business presentations. "It will just take a minute." "Whatever it is can wait," Brandon said, his tone dismissive. "We have investors coming tonight. I need you to look perfect and stay quiet. Think you can manage that?" The words stung more than they should have. Over the past months, Brandon had become increasingly critical. Her clothes were too simple, her conversation too boring, her small-town background embarrassing. Victoria had tried to change, spending thousands on designer dresses and etiquette classes, but nothing seemed good enough anymore. "Of course," she whispered, retreating toward the kitchen. But as she passed the home office, Victoria noticed something that stopped her cold. Mail was scattered across Brandon's desk, and her name wasn't on any of it. Not the utility bills, not the mortgage statements, nothing. She picked up a document and her blood ran cold. The marriage certificate was there, but something was wrong. The signatures looked different, and the witness names were people she had never met. Victoria grabbed her phone and searched the marriage license database. Her hands shook as the results loaded. No record found. She searched again, using different spellings, different dates. Nothing. According to the state of California, Victoria Hayes and Brandon Mitchell had never been legally married. The pregnancy test felt heavy in her pocket as the truth crashed over her. She wasn't Mrs. Mitchell. She was just another woman living in Brandon's house, completely dependent on his generosity. A generosity that could disappear at any moment. The sound of cars pulling into the driveway interrupted her panic. The investors were arriving for tonight's party, the one that would celebrate Mitchell Tech going public. Brandon's company was valued at over $2 billion, and he was about to become one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. Victoria touched her still flat stomach and made a silent promise. Whatever it took, she would protect this child. Even if it meant confronting the man she thought she had married about the lies he had built their entire relationship on. She had no idea that tonight would be the beginning of the end of everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the man she had given her entire life to. The party was in full swing by 8 p.m. Tech executives, venture capitalists, and celebrities filled the sprawling backyard that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. The infinity pool reflected string lights and laughter, creating the perfect backdrop for what should have been the happiest night of Victoria's life. Instead, she felt like a ghost haunting her own home. Victoria wore a flowing emerald dress that hid her early pregnancy, but she couldn't hide the hollow feeling in her chest. She watched Brandon work the crowd with his natural charisma, shaking hands and making deals worth millions of dollars. Scarlett stayed close to his side, playing the role Victoria should have been filling. Gorgeous party, isn't it? Margaret Wells appeared beside Victoria, holding two champagne flutes. At 45, Maggie was a successful entertainment lawyer with sharp eyes and an even sharper wit. She was one of the few people in Brandon's circle who had always been kind to Victoria. "Thank you," Victoria said, accepting the sparkling water Maggie offered instead of champagne. "Brandon planned everything." "I'm sure he did." Maggie's tone was neutral, but something in her expression made Victoria look closer. "How are you feeling? Honey, you look a little pale." Victoria hesitated. She had been so isolated over the past year, slowly losing touch with her old friends as Brandon's world consumed her completely. Maggie was the only person who still treated her like an actual person, rather than an accessory. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said quietly. "Hypothetically, if someone discovered their marriage wasn't legal, what would that mean?" Maggie's eyebrows rose. "Hypothetically, it would mean they have no legal rights to property, assets, or support. They would essentially be a long-term guest with no protection under family law." Victoria's heart sank. And if that person was pregnant, then they would be a single mother with no claim to the father's wealth or support, unless he voluntarily provided it. Maggie studied Victoria's face carefully. "This is a very specific hypothetical question." Before Victoria could respond, Brandon's voice boomed across the patio. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make." The crowd gathered around the pool as Brandon raised his champagne glass. Scarlett stood beside him, radiant in a white cocktail dress that cost more than Victoria's car. Victoria felt a chill of premonition. "2 years ago, I met the most incredible woman at a coffee shop in downtown LA. Brandon began. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Victoria stepped forward, thinking he was finally going to publicly acknowledge their relationship, but Brandon's eyes found Scarlett, not Victoria. "Scarlett Monroe changed my life from the moment we met. Tonight, as Mitchell Tech goes public and we celebrate this incredible milestone, I want to share another piece of good news." He dropped to one knee beside the pool, pulling out a ring box. "Scarlett, will you marry me?" The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Camera phones flashed as Scarlett squealed and threw her arms around Brandon's neck. Victoria stood frozen, watching the man she thought was her husband propose to another woman at their own home. "Oh my God," Maggie whispered beside her. "Victoria, I'm so sorry." But Victoria couldn't respond. The world had tilted off its axis. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling sick. This wasn't just betrayal. This was complete annihilation of everything she thought her life was. She turned and pushed through the crowd, desperate to reach the house before she completely broke down. But as she reached the French doors, a strong hand grabbed her arm. "Where are you going?" Brandon hissed in her ear. "You're embarrassing me." Victoria spun around, tears streaming down her face. "Embarrassing you? You just proposed to another woman at our home." "Our home?" Brandon's laugh was cruel. "Sweetheart, this is my home. You just live here, and if you keep making a scene, you won't even have that much longer." The threat was clear, and Victoria realized with stunning clarity that she had no power here, no legal rights, no money of her own, no way to fight back. She was completely at Brandon's mercy. And Brandon Mitchell, as she was learning, had no mercy at all. 3 weeks after the engagement party, Victoria was still reeling from the brutal reality of her situation. She had tried to confront Brandon about the fake marriage certificate, but he had simply laughed and told her she was paranoid. When she threatened to leave, he had reminded her that she had nowhere to go. He was right. Victoria had quit her teaching job when they got together. Her savings account was empty. Her credit cards were in Brandon's name, and her family back in Ohio thought she was living the dream in California. How could she tell them the truth? The morning sickness had started, making everything worse. Victoria spent most days alone in the mansion while Brandon was at the office and Scarlett was shopping for their real wedding. She felt like a prisoner in a golden cage. That's when Jake Hayes walked back into her life. Victoria was throwing up in the guest bathroom when she heard the doorbell. She wiped her mouth and stumbled to the front door, expecting a delivery driver. Instead, she found herself face to face with her older brother for the first time in 3 years. Jake looked exactly like she remembered, but harder around the edges. Military life had carved sharp lines into his face and put steel in his green eyes. His brown hair was shorter now, and his muscular frame filled out his casual clothes in a way that suggested barely contained power. "Hey, Tori," he said softly. Victoria burst into tears and threw her arms around him. For the first time in months, she felt safe. "What are you doing here?" she asked, pulling him inside. "I'm working private security in LA now," Jake explained. "Heard through the grapevine that you married some tech hotshot. Thought I'd check in on my little sister." They sat in the living room where Brandon had proposed to Scarlett just weeks before. Victoria wanted to tell Jake everything, but she was afraid. What if he judged her for being so naive? What if he couldn't help? "You look thin," Jake observed. "And pale. Everything okay?" Victoria opened her mouth to lie, the way she had been lying to everyone for months. But something in Jake's steady gaze broke through her defenses. The whole story came pouring out. The fake marriage, the pregnancy, Brandon's cruelty, and Scarlett's upcoming wedding. Jake listened without interrupting, but Victoria could see the fury building in his expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" he asked finally. "No, I have nothing. Jake, no money, no job, no legal claim to anything. I'm completely trapped." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the infinity pool where Victoria's life had imploded. "Brandon Mitchell," he said thoughtfully. "Mitchell Tech is going public next month." "Yes, the IPO is supposed to make him a billionaire." "Interesting." Jake turned back to her. "Tori, I want you to trust me. Okay, I'm going to help you, but I need you to be patient." "Can you do that?" Victoria nodded, clinging to the first hope she had felt in weeks. "Good. Now, is Mitchell coming home for lunch?" "He never comes home for lunch." "Why?" Jake smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't entirely reassuring. "Because I want to have a conversation with your husband, or should I say your fake husband." Victoria felt a chill of fear mixed with anticipation. She had never seen Jake in full protective mode, but she remembered stories from their childhood. Her big brother had always been willing to fight for what was right, and he had never lost. Brandon Mitchell was about to discover what happened when you messed with a Navy SEAL's little sister. But Victoria had no idea that Jake's appearance wasn't a coincidence, and that her brother's help would come with a price she never could have imagined. Brandon arrived home early that afternoon, something he never did. Victoria heard his Tesla pull into the driveway and felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Jake had been pacing the living room for an hour, and the tension in his body reminded her of a coiled spring. "Remember what I told you," Jake said quietly. "Stay calm, don't interrupt, and let me handle this." Brandon walked through the front door with his phone pressed to his ear, arguing with someone about stock prices. When he saw Jake, he stopped mid-sentence. "I'll call you back," Brandon said, ending the call. His eyes narrowed as he studied Jake's military bearing and obvious strength. "Who are you?" "Jake Hayes," Jake said, extending his hand. Victoria's brother. Brandon's expression shifted to his practiced charm as he shook Jake's hand. "Of course Tori's mentioned you. Military, right? Thank you for your service." "Navy SEAL," Jake replied. "Recently discharged." "Impressive. What brings you to LA?" "Checking on my sister." Jake's tone was conversational, but Victoria could hear the steel underneath. "Funny thing, though, I did some research on you before I came." Brandon's smile tightened slightly. "Research. Mitchell Tech is an interesting company, built on stolen code from a smaller startup. If the rumors are true, and your personal life is even more fascinating." The mask was starting to slip from Brandon's face. "I'm not sure what you think you know." "I know my sister isn't legally married to you," Jake interrupted. "I know you've been stringing her along while planning to marry someone else. And I know she's pregnant with your child." Victoria held her breath as the two men stared at each other. Brandon was taller, but Jake had the presence of someone who had faced death and survived. Your sister is free to leave anytime she wants, Brandon said finally. No one's forcing her to stay. With what money? What job? What support system? Jake took a step closer. You've systematically isolated her and made her completely dependent on you. That's called financial abuse. Brandon laughed, but it sounded hollow. You can't prove anything. And even if you could, so what? She's an adult. She made her choices. You're right, Jake said calmly. I can't prove the emotional manipulation, but I can prove the fraud. He pulled out a folder and handed it to Brandon. Fake marriage documents, identity theft, wire fraud. The FBI tends to take these things seriously, especially when they involve someone about to have a massive IP. Victoria watched Brandon's face pale as he flipped through the documents. Where did you get these? I have friends in interesting places, Jake replied. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Brandon was quiet for a long moment, his quick mind clearly calculating options. When he looked up, his expression had changed completely. The charming mask was gone, replaced by cold calculation. What do you want, he asked. A clean divorce settlement for Victoria, $5 million, and she walks away quietly. No media, no scandal, no FBI investigation. $5 million, Brandon's voice was incredulous. For what? She hasn't contributed anything to my success. Jake's expression didn't change, but Victoria felt the temperature in the room drop. She's carrying your child. She gave up her career for you. She's been your perfect accessory for 2 years. I'd say that's worth $5 million of your soon-to-be billion-dollar fortune. Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Jake was negotiating for her like she was a business deal. But she supposed that's exactly what her relationship with Brandon had become. Brandon was quiet for several minutes, clearly running calculations. Finally, he nodded. Fine, $5 million. But she signs a non-disclosure agreement, and she's out of the house by the end of the week. Deal, Ben, Jake said. But if you try to screw her over or go back on this agreement, those FBI contacts of mine will be very interested in your business practices. Brandon's smile was sharp as a blade. Understood. Pleasure doing business with you. As he walked upstairs, Victoria felt a mixture of relief and hollowness. She was free and financially secure, but she was also homeless and heartbroken. The man she had loved had just negotiated her away like she was a used car. $5 million, Tori, Jake said gently. You can start over anywhere you want. Victoria nodded, trying to feel grateful. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too easy. And she had no idea that both men in her life were keeping secrets that would soon destroy everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and family. Moving out of the Malibu mansion felt surreal. Victoria packed her belongings into suitcases, realizing how little she actually owned after 2 years of living in luxury. Most of the designer clothes and jewelry had been gifts from Brandon, and she wanted nothing from him except her freedom. Jake helped her move into a furnished apartment in Santa Monica, close to the beach where they had played as children during family vacations. The settlement paperwork was signed, the non-disclosure agreement executed, and Brandon had transferred the $5 million into an account Jake had set up for her. For the first time in months, Victoria felt like she could breathe. What now? She asked Jake as they sat on her new balcony, watching the sunset over the Pacific. Now you rest, Jake said. You're 4 months pregnant. You've been under incredible stress, and you need to focus on taking care of yourself and the baby. Victoria touched her growing bump. She was finally starting to show. And despite everything, she was excited about becoming a mother. I was thinking about going back to teaching. There's a charter school in Venice that needs art teachers. That sounds perfect, Jake agreed. But maybe wait until after the baby is born. You have enough money to take your time and make the right decisions. Victoria studied her brother's profile in the fading light. Jake, how did you really get all that information on Brandon? You said you have friends in interesting places, but that seemed like more than just military connections. Jake was quiet for a moment. I work for a private security firm now. We do background checks, personal protection, corporate investigations. When I heard you were married to a tech billionaire, I did some digging. But why you hadn't talked to me in 3 years? Because you're my sister, Jake said simply. And I knew something was wrong when you stopped calling mom and dad. Victoria felt a surge of love for her brother, mixed with guilt about their lost time. I'm sorry I disappeared. Brandon made me feel like my old life was embarrassing. That's what guys like him do, Jake said grimly. They isolate their victims so they have complete control. They spent the evening planning Victoria's new life. She would take childbirth classes, find a good pediatrician, maybe even start painting again. For the first time since she had discovered the fake marriage certificate, Victoria felt hopeful about the future. But that night, as she lay in her new bed listening to the ocean waves, Victoria couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was wrong. The confrontation with Brandon had been too easy. Men like him didn't just hand over $5 million without a fight. She was right to be suspicious. 3 days later, Victoria was at a prenatal appointment when her phone exploded with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, and social media alerts flooded her screen. With shaking hands, she opened the first news article. Tech billionaire Brandon Mitchell accuses ex-girlfriend of extortion. Victoria's blood ran cold as she read the article. According to Brandon, Victoria Hayes was a gold digger who had tried to extort money from him by claiming to be his wife. He had only paid the settlement to avoid scandal during his IPO, but now he was setting the record straight. The article included photos of Victoria at the engagement party, looking jealous and unstable. It quoted unnamed sources saying she had threatened to hurt herself if Brandon didn't leave Scarlett for her. It painted her as a delusional woman who had inserted herself into Brandon's life and refused to leave. Victoria's hands shook as she scrolled through more articles, each one more damaging than the last. Her phone rang, and she saw Jake's name on the screen. Tori, where are you? Jake's voice was urgent. At the doctor's office. Jake, what is this? What's happening? Brandon's playing dirty. He's trying to destroy your credibility before you can use any of the information I gave you. But I signed a non-disclosure agreement. I can't say anything. That's the point, Jake said grimly. He can say whatever he wants, but you can't defend yourself. Get home now. We need to figure out our next move. Victoria left the doctor's office in a daze. The parking garage felt ominous as she walked to her car, but she attributed her unease to stress. She didn't notice the black SUV following her home, or the photographer with a telephoto lens capturing her every move. By the time she reached her apartment, the story had gone viral. Her phone was buzzing with calls from reporters, and there were news vans parked outside her building. Victoria Hayes was about to learn that escaping from Brandon Mitchell's world wasn't going to be as easy as signing a few papers. And her brother Jake, the one person she trusted completely, was about to reveal a secret that would shatter what was left of her faith in love and loyalty. Victoria couldn't leave her apartment for 3 days. Reporters camped outside her building, waiting for a statement she was legally prohibited from giving. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests, and social media was brutal. Thousands of strangers were calling her a gold digger, a liar, and worse. Jake stayed with her, screening calls and bringing groceries. He seemed as angry as she was about Brandon's media blitz, but Victoria noticed he was spending a lot of time on his phone, having quiet conversations in the hallway. On the 4th day, Detective Sarah Collins knocked on Victoria's door. Ms. Hayes, I'm with the LAPD Financial Crimes Unit. We need to talk. Victoria's blood ran cold as she let the detective in. Sarah Collins was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't tolerate lies. I'm investigating allegations of extortion against you, Detective Collins said, settling onto Victoria's couch. Brandon Mitchell claims you threatened to destroy his reputation unless he paid you $5 million. That's not what happened, Victoria said desperately. I never threatened him. My brother handled the negotiations. Speaking of your brother, where is he now? Victoria looked around, realizing Jake wasn't in the apartment. I don't know. He was here this morning. Detective Collins studied Victoria carefully. Ms. Hayes, I'm going to be direct with you. The evidence against you is substantial. We have recordings of phone calls, financial records showing the payment, and witness testimony about your behavior at Mr. Mitchell's engagement party. Recordings? What recordings? Your brother negotiating the payment. Mr. Mitchell was wearing a wire. Victoria felt the world tilt sideways. A wire? Oh, why would he be wearing a wire? Because he's been cooperating with our investigation into your extortion scheme. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. That's impossible. Brandon was the one who defrauded me. He faked our marriage. He lied about everything. Detective Collins pulled out a folder. We've examined the documents your brother provided. The marriage certificate isn't fake. Ms. Hayes, it's real. You were legally married to Brandon Mitchell in Las Vegas 2 years ago. Victoria stared at the detective in confusion. But I was never in Las Vegas. I would remember getting married. According to this certificate, you were, along with 2 witnesses who have provided sworn statements about the ceremony. Victoria's head was spinning. Nothing made sense. Can I see the certificate? Detective Collins handed it over, and Victoria gasped. The signature looked like hers, but she had no memory of writing it. The photo showed her in a white dress she didn't recognize, standing next to Brandon in what appeared to be a wedding chapel. This is impossible, Victoria whispered. I've never seen this dress before. I don't remember any of this. Memory can be unreliable, especially under stress, Detective Collins said, but her tone suggested she was beginning to doubt the official story. Where is my brother? Victoria asked. We'd like to know that too. Jake Hayes seems to have disappeared right around the time we started investigating this case. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Meet me at Pier 39, come alone, trust me. Jay, Detective Collins saw Victoria's expression change. What is it? Nothing. Victoria lied, her mind racing. Something was very wrong here, and she was starting to suspect that everyone she trusted had been lying to her. Ms. Hayes, I'm going to give you some advice. If your brother contacts you, convince him to turn himself in. Right now, you are looking at accessory charges. If he runs, you'll be looking at conspiracy. After Detective Collins left, Victoria sat in her empty apartment trying to make sense of everything. The marriage certificate, with her signature that she didn't remember signing, the recordings of Jake that she hadn't known existed, her brother's sudden disappearance just when things got complicated, and underneath it all, a growing certainty that she had been played by everyone in her life. Victoria looked at the text message again. Going to meet Jake was probably stupid, possibly dangerous, and definitely against Detective Collins' advice. But she needed answers, and Jake was the only person who might have them. As she grabbed her keys and headed for the door, Victoria realized she was about to discover that her story was far from over. In fact, the worst betrayal was still to come. Pier 39 was crowded with tourists and street performers, but Victoria spotted Jake immediately. He was standing by the railing overlooking the bay, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. He looked like a man trying not to be recognized. Victoria approached carefully, her heart pounding. Jake. He turned, and she was shocked by how haggard he looked. Tori, thank God you came. The police are looking for you, Victoria said without preamble. They think we're running an extortion scheme together. Jake's jaw tightened. That's because Brandon has been 3 steps ahead of us from the beginning. What are you talking about? Jake looked around nervously, then guided Victoria to a quieter section of the pier. Tori, I haven't been completely honest with you. I didn't just randomly decide to look into Brandon's background. Victoria's stomach clenched. What do you mean I've been working for him? The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Working for him since when? Since about 6 months after you got together with him, Jake said miserably. He hired my security firm to keep an eye on you. Background surveillance, making sure you weren't talking to the wrong people, reporting back on your activities. Victoria staggered backward. You've been spying on me for 2 years. It wasn't supposed to be like that, Jake said desperately. At first, I thought it was just standard rich guy paranoia, protecting his assets, making sure you weren't a gold digger. But then I realized what kind of man he really was. So you decided to help me. Jake's expression grew even more pained. Tori, the confrontation at the house, the evidence I showed Brandon. He knew I was coming. We rehearsed the whole thing. Victoria felt like she was falling into an abyss. Rehearsed it. Brandon wanted you to think you had leverage over him. He wanted you to believe you were getting a fair settlement. But the whole thing was theater designed to make you complicit in what would look like extortion. Why? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Because he needed you gone, but he also needed you discredited. If you ever tried to tell anyone the truth about your relationship, who would believe you? You'd just be the crazy ex-girlfriend who tried to extort money from a billionaire. Victoria sank onto a nearby bench, her hands shaking. The marriage certificate, Detective Collins showed me. Is it real? Jake sat beside her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Yes and no, you really did sign it. But you don't remember because Brandon drugged you. Drugged me, Rohypnol. Probably. You signed the papers in a semi-conscious state. The whole Vegas wedding was staged to create legal documents while keeping you unaware of what was happening. Victoria felt sick. How long have you known this? I started suspecting something when I saw the prenatal vitamin bottles at the mansion. Brandon was having them specially made. I had them tested, and they contained low doses of benzodiazepines, enough to keep you compliant and confused, but not enough to harm the baby. My God, Victoria whispered. He's been drugging me for months. The pregnancy was the catalyst, Jake continued. Brandon couldn't risk you getting stronger or more independent once the baby was born. He needed you gone, but in a way that would ensure your permanent silence. Victoria looked at her brother with fresh eyes. And you helped him do this to me. I tried to protect you within the constraints of the situation. Jake said weakly. I made sure you got a substantial settlement. I documented everything so we could potentially expose him later. But you betrayed me, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. You let me believe my own brother was rescuing me when you were actually part of the plot to destroy me. Jake's face crumpled. I know. I'm so sorry, Tori. I thought I could outplay him. But Brandon Mitchell is a sociopath. He's always 3 moves ahead. Victoria stood up abruptly. Where are the real documents? The evidence of what he's been doing. Hidden in a safe deposit box downtown. But Tori, if we try to use them now, it'll look like we're fabricating evidence to cover up our extortion scheme. Then what do you suggest? Victoria's voice was bitter. That I just accept being destroyed by the 2 men I trusted most. Jake looked out at the bay, his expression desperate. There might be a way, but it's dangerous, and it'll require you to trust me one more time. Victoria studied her brother's face, the man who had protected her as a child, who had served his country with honor, who had just admitted to betraying her in the cruelest way possible. What's the plan? She asked quietly. Jake turned to face her, and Victoria saw something she recognized from their childhood. Her brother's stubborn determination when he decided to fight for what was right. We're going to give Brandon Mitchell exactly what he deserves, Jake said. But first, we need to convince him that he's already won. The plan Jake outlined was risky and complex, but it was the only way to expose Brandon's crimes without looking like they were fabricating evidence. Victoria would have to play the role of a broken woman accepting defeat, while secretly gathering the proof they needed to destroy Brandon's carefully constructed lies. Step 1 was the hardest. Victoria had to return to the mansion. Are you sure about this? Jake asked as they sat in his car outside the familiar gates 3 days later. Victoria touched her growing belly, now 5 months along. He's been drugging me, lying to me, and using me for 2 years. I want him to pay for what he's done. Jake handed her a small device that looked like a hearing aid. This will record everything. The range is limited, so I'll need to stay close. Victoria nodded and walked to the front door. Brandon answered with his trademark smile, but she could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Tori, what a pleasant surprise. Come in. The mansion looked the same, but Victoria felt like she was seeing it for the first time. Every luxury item, every piece of expensive art, every symbol of Brandon's wealth now felt like evidence of his corruption. I wanted to talk to you, Victoria said, playing her role of defeated ex-girlfriend. The media attention has been overwhelming. I can't take it anymore. Brandon's smile widened. I'm sorry about that. You know how the press can be. They love a good scandal. I want to make a public statement, Victoria continued, apologizing for the misunderstanding and confirming that our relationship was consensual and that I was never your wife. Brandon studied her carefully. That would be very gracious of you. I'm sure we can work something out. As they talked, Victoria steered the conversation toward their early relationship, hoping to get Brandon to admit something incriminating. He was too smart to confess outright, but his arrogance made him reveal more than he intended. You have to understand, Tori, I never meant for things to get so complicated, Brandon said, pouring himself a drink. When we first met, you were exactly what I needed. Sweet, naive, completely devoted. The perfect trophy girlfriend. But then I got pregnant, Victoria prompted. That did complicate things, Brandon admitted. Well, Scarlett was always the long-term plan. You see, she fits my world in ways you never could. But I couldn't just throw you away pregnant. That would have looked mocked for my image. Victoria felt sick listening to him talk about her like she was a business problem to be solved. But she needed more. What about the marriage certificate Detective Collins showed me, she asked. Brandon's eyes glittered with satisfaction. Clever, wasn't it? You were so trusting, so willing to follow my lead. A little pharmaceutical assistance, and you signed whatever I put in front of you. You drugged me. Nothing dangerous, Brandon said dismissively. Just something to keep you calm and compliant. You were getting too independent toward the end, asking too many questions. Victoria's hands were shaking, but she forced herself to continue. And my brother, how long has he been working for you? Jake, since almost the beginning, I needed someone to keep an eye on you. Make sure you weren't talking to the wrong people. He came highly recommended. But he tried to help me in the end. Brandon laughed. Tori, sweetheart, your brother never tried to help you. Everything that happened was orchestrated to get you to take the money and disappear. The confrontation, the evidence, the settlement negotiation, it was all theater. Victoria felt tears on her cheeks, but they were tears of rage, not sadness. Why go to all this trouble? Because, my dear, I couldn't risk you becoming a problem later. This way, you are completely discredited. If you ever try to tell your story, who's going to believe the woman who tried to extort Brandon Mitchell? Brandon moved closer, and Victoria forced herself not to recoil. You know what the beautiful part is? Even if you're recording this conversation right now, it doesn't matter. You're a known extortionist talking to your victim. Any evidence you produce will look fabricated. Victoria's heart sank. Brandon was right. Even with his confession, her credibility was destroyed. But Brandon hadn't counted on Victoria's final card to play. You're probably right, Victoria said softly. But there's one thing you didn't consider. What's that? Victoria pulled out her phone and showed Brandon the screen. It displayed a live stream with over 50,000 viewers and counting. I've been broadcasting this entire conversation on social media, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. 50,000 people just heard you confess to drugging me, faking legal documents, and orchestrating an elaborate scheme to destroy my life. Brandon's face went white. That's impossible. You couldn't have. Jake set it up before I came in. Everyone can see that this is live and unedited. They can see the timestamp, the location data, everything. Brandon lunged for the phone, but Victoria was ready. She stepped back and continued addressing the camera. My name is Victoria Hayes, and I want everyone to know the truth about Brandon Mitchell. He's not the charming tech genius you see in the media. He's a predator who destroys women's lives for sport. The live stream viewer count was climbing rapidly. Comments were pouring in from people expressing outrage and support. Victoria could see that the story was already being picked up by news outlets. Brandon was frantically calling someone on his phone, probably his lawyer or publicist, but it was too late. The truth was out, and this time Victoria had the evidence to back it up. As sirens wailed in the distance, Jake had called the police as soon as Brandon confessed. Victoria realized that she had finally beaten the man who had tried to destroy her. But her victory was about to be overshadowed by a twist that no one saw coming. The aftermath of the live stream was swift and brutal. Within hours, Brandon's confession had been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms. Justice for Victoria was trending worldwide, and reporters were digging into every aspect of Brandon Mitchell's life and business practices. Detective Sarah Collins arrived at the mansion with a warrant for Brandon's arrest. The charges included fraud, drugging without consent, identity theft, and conspiracy. Mitchell Tech's stock price plummeted as investors fled, and the IPO was indefinitely postponed. Victoria watched from Jake's car as Brandon was led away in handcuffs. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe freely. It's over, Jake said quietly. He can't hurt you anymore. Victoria looked at her brother, the man who had betrayed her but ultimately helped her find the strength to fight back. What happens now with us? I mean, Jake's expression was pained. I don't expect you to forgive me, Tori. What I did was unforgivable. I should have protected you from the beginning instead of enabling your abuser. You were in an impossible situation, Victoria said slowly. And in the end, you helped me expose the truth. But I should have, Jake, Victoria's voice was firm. I'm choosing to forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, but because I need to heal. And I can't do that while carrying anger toward my brother. Jake's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Over the next few weeks, the full scope of Brandon's crimes became clear. The FBI investigation revealed that Victoria wasn't his only victim. Brandon had used similar tactics on at least 12 other women over the past decade, systematically isolating and manipulating them before discarding them when they became inconvenient. Most shocking of all, investigators discovered that Brandon's first wife, a woman named Jennifer Patterson, who had supposedly died in a car accident 5 years earlier, had actually been murdered. Brandon had staged the crash after Jennifer threatened to expose his business practices. Victoria testified before a grand jury, her live-streamed confession providing crucial evidence for the prosecution. Scarlett Monroe, the Instagram influencer who had been complicit in Victoria's humiliation, was arrested as an accessory after investigators found evidence that she had helped Brandon drug Victoria on multiple occasions. The media narrative shifted completely. Victoria went from being portrayed as a gold-digging extortionist to being celebrated as a brave survivor who had exposed a dangerous predator. Speaking requests poured in from advocacy groups and news programs, but Victoria wasn't interested in fame. As her pregnancy progressed into the third trimester, she focused on preparing for motherhood and rebuilding her life on her own terms. She moved to a small house in Carmel, a coastal town where she could paint and raise her daughter in peace. The $5 million from the settlement, money she was now legally entitled to keep, provided financial security. But more importantly, it gave her the freedom to make choices based on what was right rather than what was necessary for survival. On a foggy October morning, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Hope. As she held her daughter for the first time, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been broken down, built back up, betrayed, and ultimately redeemed. She had learned that love without respect was worthless, that silence in the face of abuse was complicity, and that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who can hurt you deepest. But she had also learned that she was stronger than she ever imagined, that truth has a way of surfacing even when it's buried under lies, and that the greatest victory isn't revenge, it's the freedom to write your own story. Brandon Mitchell was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Jennifer Patterson. He would be an old man when he was released, his empire completely destroyed. Victoria didn't attend the sentencing. She was too busy teaching her daughter how to hold a paintbrush. 2 years later, Victoria stood in her art studio overlooking Monterey Bay, putting the finishing touches on a painting that would be featured in her first gallery show. The canvas depicted a woman emerging from dark water into brilliant sunlight, her face turned toward the sky with an expression of fierce determination. It was called surfacing. Hope toddled around the studio, her chubby hands leaving fingerprints on everything she could reach. At 2 years old, she had Victoria's dark hair and Jake's green eyes, and a personality that was entirely her own, fearless, curious, and stubborn in the best possible way. "Mama, up I am," Hope demanded, raising her arms toward Victoria. Victoria lifted her daughter and pointed toward the bay, where sea otters were floating on their backs in the kelp beds. "Look, baby girl, see the otters?" Hope clapped her hands in delight, and Victoria felt the familiar surge of gratitude that had become her default emotion. Every day with Hope was a gift, a reminder that something beautiful had come from the darkest period of her life. The doorbell rang, and Victoria went to answer it with Hope on her hip. Detective Sarah Collins stood on the porch, but she was smiling instead of wearing her usual serious expression. "Sarah, what brings you to Carmel?" "Just wanted to give you an update in person," Sarah said, following Victoria into the living room. "Brandon's appeal was denied. The conviction stands, and he'll serve the full sentence." Victoria nodded, feeling a distant sense of closure. "And the other women?" "Most of them are doing well. Jennifer Patterson's family finally has answers and closure. The civil suits are proceeding, and Brandon's remaining assets are being distributed to his victims." Victoria had donated most of her settlement money to organizations supporting domestic violence survivors. She kept enough to ensure Hope's future security, but the rest went to help other women escape situations like hers. "There's something else," Sarah continued. The FBI wants to use your case as part of their training program for financial crimes investigators. Your live stream strategy has become a model for how victims can safely gather evidence against sophisticated predators. Victoria was honored but not surprised. Over the past 2 years, she had spoken at conferences and worked with law enforcement agencies to help them understand the psychological tactics used by manipulative abusers. It was her way of ensuring that other women wouldn't suffer the way she had. After Sarah left, Victoria sat on her deck watching Hope play in the garden. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake, who was now working for a nonprofit organization that provided security training to women's shelters. Saw the news about the appeal. How are you feeling? Victoria typed back, free, finally, completely free. It was true, for the first time since she had met Brandon Mitchell. Victoria felt like she was living her own life instead of reacting to someone else's manipulation. She had meaningful work, a daughter she adored, and a future full of possibilities. That evening, as Victoria tucked Hope into bed, her daughter looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mama strong," Hope said in her toddler voice. Victoria smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "Yes, baby, Mama is strong, and you're going to be strong too." After Hope fell asleep, Victoria went back to her studio and started a new painting. This one showed a woman teaching a little girl to swim in calm, clear water. Both figures were surrounded by light, and in the distance, storm clouds were moving away from the sun. Victoria had learned that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up, every single time, until you were standing on solid ground again. It was about protecting the people you love, speaking truth in the face of lies, and refusing to let anyone else write your story. She had been pushed toward the water once, literally and metaphorically, but she had learned to swim. And now she was teaching others to do the same. As she painted in the quiet of the night, with her daughter sleeping peacefully down the hall and the sound of waves breaking gently on the shore, Victoria knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better, a real life built on truth, courage, and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The girl from small-town Ohio who had once believed that love meant staying silent had become a woman who understood that love, real love, meant finding your voice and using it to protect what matters most. And that was the most powerful victory of all. This story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when we feel most powerless and alone, we possess an inner strength that can't be taken away. Sometimes the people we trust most will disappoint us, but that doesn't mean we're destined to be victims. We all have the power to surface from whatever depths we've been pushed into, to speak our truth, and to build lives worthy of our courage. If Victoria's story touched your heart, remember that you too have the strength to rise above whatever challenges you're facing. Your voice matters, your truth is valid, and your future is yours to write.